Yeah, and there's bad news too, which is, what I've kind of been alluding to this whole time. This stuff's hard to do. There's a lot of, you're picking kind of, in this presentation, the two of the most contentious issues out there, water and land use development. And it's one thing to talk about the concepts that I've talked about here, and these are probably things that aren't unfamiliar to any of you, but it's another thing to try and do them. So with that, I just want to close with a couple different implementation ideas, recognizing that it does take something to go from the idea to putting the idea on the ground. And I'm going to start with the second one here, aligning local codes with water and land use goals. If you had looked at the bullets on especially the development pattern piece that I presented earlier, you would have noticed in every one of those that there was a bullet for remove policy barriers. And that's because conventional zoning really drives a lot of these challenges that we're dealing with. And zoning's, it's the DNA of our communities. It's what we get. We get what's on the ground because that's what we've sort of planned for. This stuff didn't come out of nowhere. It's in our codes, and unfortunately, a lot of our codes are outdated. If this is the stuff we want that I was talking about, this is what our codes give us. And these things are driven by a combination of use separation, bulk regulations, which are sort of the dimensional standards that are in codes that tell you, how big your yard has to be and things of that nature, whether your building can be 1 or 2 stories. Parking requirements are one of the trickiest, most annoying thing out there. You need enough parking to be able to keep businesses happy and keep customers going in, and you also don't want so much that you completely separate and disconnect the built environment. And then, of course, street design and how we sort of start creating these more walkable streets and walkable communities. And so again, on the flip side of that, reducing impervious cover and reducing these impacts more broadly of development in our watersheds really comes down to sort of applying the full gamut of the things I've been talking about. And that's how we can start aligning land use and watershed planning. So there are places that are trying to start fixing their codes. It's a pain in the rear. I did a code review and reform project in California directly related to watershed planning projects. We worked with some watershed organizations in 2 regions in California and said, let's take your watershed plan and your land use plan and your local codes and see what happens when we match up the goals in all these and then the provisions in the code. It was ugly, both in terms of how much work it was and how mind-numbing it was, and also in terms of the disconnects, again. And then going up to back to the first piece that I was talking about, regional coordination, and I think you guys have a great opportunity to play into this with the watershed planning effort, is just fundamental to addressing any of these issues. There's so many connected issues in these communities, especially these amenity communities, which is what I call them, like we have here, where you've got a setup where you've got a Vail or an Aspen or something like that connected so closely to the communities, the gateway communities down from the resort. And I remember growing up, we were in East Vail early on, and we were sort of one of the first waves to move west. When we moved to Edwards, it was kind of crazy. You guys are moving where? To Edwards? And it was a long distance phone call, and now I don't think anybody at my school where I went lives in Vail anymore. You can't. So these issues of housing affordability and transportation and open space preservation and watershed management, these are all incredibly connected in these regions, particularly places like this. And it's very difficult to address any one of these issues at the community scale, just one community. The town of Eagle can't solve this stuff. Vail can't, Avon can't, and the county on its own can't. So it's really coordination between those local jurisdictions and the organizations like the Eagle River Watershed Council that creates the capacity and ability to do this. Of course, that's much easier, again, to say than it is to do. But we need to recognize that we're not going to make headway unless we have that level of coordination. There's some trends and opportunities there, in addition to just talking to one another more often. Obviously, I've sort of thrown the idea of watershed planning out there as an opportunity. You guys are already doing that, and it's an opportunity, I think, to not only tackle some of these watershed issues, but to look outside the box a little bit about what else is going on and development and land use issues that are happening. And one of the ways that there's potentially an opportunity or some trends that are going on in other types of regional planning is called regional scenario planning. And this has been done quite a bit recently. It's nothing new, but it's been done quite a bit recently to better connect land use and transportation. The idea is pretty simple. You develop a set of scenarios for sort of an alternative future for a region, and you test those according to different metrics. You know, a great example that's actually had a huge influence on some of the climate change policy that's been implemented or is being implemented in California is the Sacramento Regional Blueprint. For some people who might be watching this on TV, that'll either scare them or get them interested. But what this did is it was a 5-county area that looked at different growth futures. And just as one example, this was sort of the base case scenario compared to the preferred scenario. And this here we're looking at the sort of open space impacts, and it showed that 304 square miles of land would be, less land would be developed with the preferred scenario. That's quite a lot. And of course, they looked at this across a range of impacts, again, most particularly on the land use transportation connection and looking at traffic impacts and vehicle miles traveled and CO2 and all these different things. The opportunity is there to look at water implications of the different development patterns and to use a scenario planning tool of this very nature to look at what are the water implications of different ways of growing. And then again, those are a couple ideas that are out there that I'm floating for places like Eagle County and the Eagle River Watershed Council to think about what could you do in the future to start looking at some of these connections I've talked about. So, you know, I recognize none of this stuff's easy. It's easier to talk about this type of integration of these concepts, but I think just starting to recognize the linkages between water and land use is a good step, and I really appreciate you guys inviting me here tonight to talk about it. Thanks.
Do you guys have any questions for Clark? Yeah. We're going to, this is mic to the camera, so I'm going to pass this around. Excuse me.
You know, you talked about the parking lots and that, and it would be nice to be able to collect the runoff, but do you have to go through an exhaustive biological treatment to reintroduce that to the water, or will plants take care of that for you?
Yeah, what they're doing is, again, it's this phenomenal merger between the engineering and design worlds. And they're using these different, they call them structural soils. And it's essentially an engineered set of soils that can include different mulches, and they ensure there's different microbes in there. And then it's that with the combination of different vegetation types that tend to be, it depends on the region, you know, so what you have here that's going to work is going to be different than the Front Range, is going to be different than Phoenix. But yeah, you can design essentially that sort of mini ecosystem to sit in your parking lot and capture and slowly drain that stormwater for you and treat it as it does. So the key thing that it does is it slows it down. So you slow down that rush of stormwater into the stream and stream banks. But the other thing it does is it does pull out those pollutants. You raise a good question, though, which a lot of people are wondering over time in terms of maintenance. Well, you know, what happens after 6 years of filtering pollutants out of something like that? Do you eventually, you know, do you have to dig it out? And the answer is probably maybe not. We're not totally sure whether or not, it's looking like if it's really well designed, the system can maintain itself better than it would. It's probably still going to require some maintenance. And then if you're pretty, you know, basic with it and you just throw some soils and plants in there, you're going to have to maintain it more.